Okay. Hello, everybody. This is Sean Ferguson from the American Library Association, Preservation Outreach Committee in the Division of Core. I'm here with Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, the Preservation Week Honorary Chair, and our theme for this year is Building Resilient Communities. I'm so happy to have you here, Dr. Mona.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so
I
great
thought
to be here. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here with you and with everybody to celebrate.
No. Well, thank you, Dr. Mona. I thought that we'd start our conversation about this week with just a question for those of you, for those who don't know you. Could you tell everybody a little bit about yourself, your work, and your connection to a resilient community?
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. And I'll try to spend just maybe 2 hours on that question. I am a pediatrician in Flint, Michigan. I have the amazing privilege of caring for a community of kiddos. I was in Flint during our water crisis and heard about lead in the water, and then really kind of that's the moment that my life changed and really started working to figure out what was going on with our kids, did the research that helped expose the water crisis, and since then have been working hand in hand with our community to build resilience and to make sure that what happened in Flint doesn't happen in any other community. So that's the very, very short version. I am a professor with Michigan State University. I run an initiative called the Pediatric Public Health Initiative, which is a partnership between Michigan State University and Hurley Children's Hospital, where we work with, once again, our community partners to improve outcomes for our kids and to really shine a spotlight on how we can do better for kids and communities everywhere.
Thank you, Dr. Mona. That's a great intro. One of the things that I wanted to start our conversation with was that, I just finished reading your book, What the Eyes Can't See, and that story of getting people to recognize the crisis that was happening in Flint, but it also provided a lot of background information about the community pediatrics program that you ran at your hospital. And one of the things I was so struck by was how important teaching the history of Flint was as a part of that community pediatrics program. And I'm curious, could you tell us a little bit about why it was important to do that in that context?
Oh, I love that question, Sean. So I guess I forgot to mention in my intro that I am also an author, which actually maybe I forget because it was never part of my master plan of life that when I went to med school, I never thought I would also write a book. But then again, I didn't think I'd be at the center of this emblematic environmental and health injustice. So yes, have written a book, which is surreal to also be an author, as a lover of literature, as a card carrying library member since I was probably 2 years old. It's just incredible to be able to put something out there and share my story. And the book is weird. So Sean, you just finished it. So it's not just like a Flint story. There's a lot of history in the book. There's Flint history and my personal history and lead history and public health history and Michigan history. And it's full of history. And there's lots of rabbit holes. And partly to blame as a consummate researcher. I can go down one rabbit hole and spend a long time there. There's a part in the book where I talk about one of my favorite heroes, Alice Hamilton. She's a physician from a century ago who was a lead expert, the first woman professor at Harvard, this amazing woman who changed kind of how we think about occupational health and medicine, and somebody who went after special interests on behalf of kids. Just an amazing person. But anyways, she's in my book for a paragraph, and I read 3 books about her and learned her history. But yeah, there's a lot of Flint history in my book. And not only is it my book, it's something that I try to teach my learners. And I still run this community pediatrics rotation. I still work a lot with learners. And I tell them, like I shared in the book, that that we walk over history every day. We literally walk over history. And if we want to figure out how to move forward, if we want to fix big problems, if as those of us in health and medicine, if we care about the health of our communities and about the patient in front of us, we have to know that history, because that history becomes part of who we are. It impacts our situations, our environments, our experiences. It gets passed down in the makeup of our bodies, and it informs health. So as a nation, we don't do a good job opening our eyes to history, especially history that might be dark or complicated. We tend to either we've never learned it or ignore it, or it just makes us uncomfortable. So, I felt it was really important for me to teach my learners, just like I was always taught, and I felt it was important to include in my book how important history was, not only how important history is to our present day, but how even more important that knowledge of history is to our tomorrows. Without that recognition of history and how we got to where we are today, it is impossible to move forward and to once again be able to fix problems. If you understand Flint history, you could have even predicted the water crisis. You're like, oh, that happened. And then this happened. And then the city was bankrupt, and then it got taken over. And then they wanted to save money. And then they changed the water to save money. So knowing that history allows us to be more prepared and prevent future problems.
I see. I learned a lot about Flint history through the book, and it became very clear to me that the city has such a dynamic history, at times being a leader in industry,
Yes.
a leader in labor rights.
Yes. Yes.
And I was curious if you felt like there were aspects of Flint history that are either underpreserved or undershared with
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. I love that question. So, and that's what people feel when they're in Flint. And that's why it's a city that's easy to fall in love with. Folks who've never been to Flint, they come to Flint like, wow, like you can feel the history and the loyalty and the grit and the pride, and how Flint has really kind of left its mark on the nation. The birthplace of cars, the birthplace of resistance and unions, and the birthplace of the middle class, and so much, civil rights and labor rights, and the list goes on. And you can still feel that history. A lot of that has been shared, but there's a lot of kind of untold stories and unsung stories, which is and I try to include some of that in my book to kind of elevate some of those unsung heroes. One of my favorite stories from Flint history is the story of another amazing woman named Janora Dollinger Johnson. And in the 1930s, when the auto workers in Flint went on strike, and this was known as the strike that was heard around the world. This is when GM was making lots of money and there was all this prosperity, but the workers were like struggling. And like on the days that they made blue cars, they were coughing up blue. And the days they made red cars, they were coughing up, red. And they were demanding that fair share of prosperity, living wages, and occupational health and safety and benefits and pensions and all these things that some folks have now, but things that people are still fighting for to this day. These auto workers went on strike, and it was a sit down strike, and they stopped production of cars. And we've heard, folks have probably heard the story. The ripple effects, birthed the UAW and really kind of birthed the middle class and informed wages across the country. What the deal that happened after that was called the Grand Bargain, which was a really big deal in employment history. But central to the story is the story of the women that weren't just like baking muffins for their husbands who are on strike. They were literally the organizers and the strategists, and they were out there on the front lines, with the men, and really informed this work. So every opportunity I can, I will elevate the story of women, especially women that we don't often know about. So this one woman, Janora Dollinger Johnson, was in her 20s, I think, and she was one of these critical organizers. She went on to head the ACLU of Michigan and spent her whole life fighting for civil rights and labor rights and for kind of marginalized populations. So I think that's one of my favorite stories, that it hasn't been shared enough. And once again, these aren't uniquely Flint stories. Every community has these amazing stories, has an amazing history, has amazing kind of legacies that we have yet to learn about.
I see. It sounds like one of the benefits of having access to your community's history is it can be quite inspiring and move you forward in resolving and facing challenges that community might have. I got the sense too that you had a lot of family history that you found inspiring during that difficult time, getting the government to recognize the problem in Flint. And so I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, when I decided to write a book, which wasn't an easy decision, a whole new respect for authors. Like, I think writing a book was harder than going to medical school. Like, it was hard. And when I committed to it, I'm like, yes, I'm going to share the story. This is a story that needs to be shared so that these kinds of things don't happen again. One of the reasons I also decided to write a book is I met my editor, Chris Jackson at Penguin Random House, who runs One World, which is this imprint that is committed to social justice stories and also committed to elevating kind of diversity in literature, different voices in literature. And I knew that if I kind of wrote my book with him, I knew that it wouldn't be about like selling copies, but really about, something much bigger than that. And he and his kind of the authors he's brought to light have also very much embraced history and why it's important to understand our history to move forward. His other authors include folks like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Brian Stevenson and Trevor Noah and all these like amazing voices who authors I adore. So anyway, when I committed to writing a book, it was just going to be like this Flint story, like being at the center of this crisis and like, uncovering this crisis and working on recovery. And then like, as I started to write that story, I'm like, wait, hold up. Like, I can't tell you about like what I did in Flint, without telling you who I am and where I came from. It wasn't writing well. It was incomplete without telling you who I was and telling you about my family and my family history. The very first line of the book is, I am Iraqi, an immigrant born somewhere else. And people pick up this book and they're like, what? I thought this was about Flint. Like, why am I learning about this person's like history? It's important. So, I leaned on my family history, throughout this crisis. And I'll share one quick story. My great uncle Nuri was how should I describe him without using profanity? So he was a rebel. He was always fighting one cause or another. And he came to MIT actually for college and became a little activist. This was during the Great Depression and he got kicked out. And he went back to Iraq because he was on government scholarship. And when he got back, he created an organization called the Association Against Imperialism and Fascism. Like, whoa, like I would sign up and like join that group. He went to Palestine to fight for Palestine's independence against British rule. He was always fighting for one cause or another. And he found his way as one of two Iraqis that went from Baghdad to Spain to fight in the Spanish Civil War. Like, whoa. And like, I would hear these stories about my great uncle Nuri when I was a kid, how like he was always, fighting for something, but it wasn't about him, and it was about something bigger than him. It wasn't about his country, race, religion. It was about big things like freedom and democracy, and protecting vulnerable, marginalized people. And he risked his life fighting in the Spanish Civil War. And because he had spent some time in the US, he was actually in the Abraham Lincoln Brigades. So like in my head, I picture him with like Ernest Hemingway and all these amazing people like fighting Franco and the Nazis in the beginning of World War II. And so like this is part of my family history. This was passed down through oral history to me as a kid. My mom used to always share that like he also had a tattoo. And when I was a kid, I'm like, oh my God, he had a tattoo. That's crazy. But even crazier was that he did really hard things, right? He did hard things. He risked his life for doing the hard thing because for the right reasons. So this was ingrained in me that you do hard things. You can do hard things. You must do hard things for the right reasons.
Mm. I love the way you call it an oral history, and the way that you can take these stories from your family's past and they influence who you are, which influences the future.
Absolutely.
I think when we talk about preservation, sometimes we think of it as being, you take a physical thing like a family heirloom and you make sure that it stays intact and you hold on to it and it passes down from family to family. But I was wondering if you thought that in some ways storytelling is another
Yeah.
way of preserving
Yes.
the past.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons I wrote a book that had a lot of the personal in it to preserve that. But it's also why I demanded reading my audiobook. So I got to record the audiobook for my book. And for me, it was like passing on this tradition of oral history. That I was such a grateful recipient of, that I could also pass on these stories in, as a book. But yeah, these, we are informed by the stories that we hear. They are as valuable as, something that our great grandma gave us, and for many of us, especially immigrants or refugees, we don't have stuff. Like, we don't have things that our parents brought or grandparents brought because of the circumstances of us being here. But we have stories, and we pass on those stories, and we pass on those values and the culture and the food and all that other great stuff that gets passed on.
Oh, I think that's a wonderful reminder of how preservation can mean different things, especially when certain groups of people have had to, abandon or lose some of those physical materials. It did make me think about one passage I loved in your book about this rug.
Yeah.
Um, but that was like one example of this
Yeah.
rather interesting item. I'd love it if you could tell the audience a little bit about that.
Yeah. So this is a rug that has been passed down, that my grandfather in Iraq had, that his parents had. It's a Persian rug that I'm trying to actually find a picture of it, that has like the leaders of the world on it. I think, is that the rug? Yeah, I think this is the rug. So it's going to be hard to share, but there is this picture of this rug that it's a Persian rug, and my grandfather is like one of these little kids in this picture. And this picture was like taken in like the 1920s. And this was in Baghdad. And so my mom grew up, with that rug in our home, and then we left Iraq. We had to leave. Saddam Hussein came in power, and nobody knew what happened to the rug, and then not until decades later were we able to somehow get that rug out of Iraq and now in our family home, and learn more about its history and kind of when it was made. And so that is one thing that we have been able to preserve, but it didn't come to us really for decades later, and through a serendipitous route. Like, I think it had to like be carried through Jordan. Like, there's a story there, which I don't totally know. But fortunately now it's something that we have, and it's something that I share with my children. And I hope that one day I can share with my grandchildren, and tell them how, this has been in our family for generations, and what it means. I love the rug, but I don't love the rug. So the rug is about like all these like famous men through history. There's about 50 men. They're all men. So I always like give like my father a hard time. Like, where are the women through history? Where are the unsung women? And I'm gonna make a new rug that's like 50 amazing women through history. Like, it has like Napoleon and George Washington and like, all these amazing people. So I love it, but I don't totally love it.
I see how, like, the context around the rug, explaining that might be an important part of passing it on too.
Yeah, yeah.
It is a product of the people who made it.
Absolutely.
I think this sort of preservation, whether it be a family treasure or stories, makes me think about how that makes communities more resilient. And that this is it's an act of resiliency to be able to keep those things and make sure that they are passed on to the next generation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as a Flint pediatrician, as a community member, I see how all of these kind of mementos, be it stories or physical things, have made the community stronger. And even through the water crisis, like there's a lot of artifacts that have been collected. For example, like I gave my doctor's coat that I used during this press conference, like is now stored in some museum. The water bottle that I held up that was filled with Flint water, it was a baby bottle filled with Flint water that I held up during the press conference where I exposed the research. That's been preserved. There's also been so many other kind of like artistic representations of different things, and collecting that history, sharing those stories is cathartic. Like it's healing. Like I see how when people are able to pass down those stories, it helps them kind of to recover and to heal. So like in a very doctor sense, that kind of that sharing of that history is important for community to recover from a crisis and to go on and to build resilience, so that they can once again, try to thrive after these things happen.
I love the idea of there being a therapeutic effect in these traumatic situations when one is able to protect and collect those types of things.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I'm totally like looking at it on the positive side, but obviously we shouldn't have to reactively, build resilience in communities after trauma. The goal should be to build resilient communities so that communities don't go through preventable traumas. And so many of our communities, we say, oh, they've got so much grit. They've been through so much, but they're doing so good. That's not how it should be. Society should work to ensure community level resilience rather than individual resilience, so that kids can just be kids and that they don't have to go through so many obstacles like poverty and racism and environmental contamination and housing insecurity, like all these different things that so many folks go through. And when they do go through that, we're like, oh, they're so resilient. No, we shouldn't celebrate that. We should be celebrating the opposite. So yes, Flint's been through a lot and they're resilient and they're informing other communities. But the goal is kind of the theme of this conference. It's how do we build resilient communities that have the infrastructure and the foundation to support people, especially our most vulnerable people, especially kids, so that they can, that they can thrive.
How do you think we make that paradigm shift from, celebrating after the fact and, oh, they're so tough, and also going from like these kids are tough or these individuals are tough to this community is strong and can weather something in the future, or we can prevent something in the future?
Yeah, I think it comes with like real community level investments, like, and we've seen it. So like a lot of our work in Flint post the water crisis is to make sure these kinds of things don't happen again. So I've had this amazing privilege of like testifying before Congress several times and advocating for national investment in resilience. So what does that look like? So, the Infrastructure Act just passed Congress. It was signed by the president. And in that Infrastructure Act, which is investing in roads and bridges and pipes and ports and broadband and all these important things, is also the largest federal investment in water infrastructure, including lead pipe removal across the country. Okay, so billions of dollars are going to remove lead pipes across the country because of our advocacy in Flint. And that is how you build a resilient community. You take away a bad thing. And, when I would testify before Congress, policymakers would be like, we can't do that. That's impossible. Like, how are we going to dig up pipes across this country and do that? And we did, and we did it in Flint. We're doing it all over. And now we're doing it across the nation. That is how you build resilient communities. You are preventative, you are proactive, rather than what we continue to do is react. The newest project I'm working on right now in Flint is called RX Kids, Prescription Kids,
Mm.
and it's the same theme. So our kids struggle with a lot of adversity, and poverty is probably one of the biggest. We're the poorest city in the state. We have a child poverty rate of over 50, like about 50%. Like we know now the science that kids who grow up and born into poverty are, it can alter their life course trajectory, especially when it's deep poverty and chronic and concentrated. So Flint is a place that says no, like, no, this is not good. This is not how kids should grow up. Like, it is not right that a kid in Flint has a 20-year difference life expectancy than a kid in another part of our county. That's not resilient. That's not how you build a resilient community. So I'm launching a program with many of our community partners called RX Kids, which is providing citywide prenatal and infant cash allowances. We're giving moms and babies cash during this critical window of life when families are the most poor. And people are like, that's a crazy idea. Like, hey, this is actually what every other country does to support people and to build resilient communities. So I just got a $15 million matching grant, which is amazing. Working to raise more money. So if anybody out there wants to donate, go to flintrxkids.com. But we are launching this. We are doing this to once again shift that paradigm, not, hey, poor you've been through so much, like read more to your kids, sign up for this program. No, how as a society can we fundamentally take a step back and build resilience in a way that shows dignity and trust and empathy for that community.
It makes me think that there's a wraparound element here of engaging all forms of potential stakeholders, whether that be the federal government or also those potential service providers in your community. It makes me think about how, if I'm recalling correctly, you were at a public hospital, which is not that common. And that gave you this role and this position to be somebody that was serving the community. It makes me think about how libraries are public libraries.
Yeah.
I wonder, like, are you familiar with any of the work that the library in Flint does to service?
Yes, they're our partners. Our library is one of our closest partners. A lot of our work is also around early literacy. I got one of the first grants I got was to launch Flint Kids Read, which is a partnership with our library and our literacy network in our schools to increase early childhood book density. And we've launched something called Born to Read. Every baby at the hospital gets bundles of books and developmental tools. We expanded Reach Out and Read, which is the clinic-based literacy program. So every book at every kid at every well visit gets books. Gosh, I think we've given out over 100,000 books in that capacity. We, with the library and our partners, have launched Imagination Library, which is the Dolly Parton program that provides every kid a book in the mail every month from 0 to 5. I think about 300,000 books have been mailed that way. And there's programming at the library that goes with a lot of these early literacy work. So the library is our partner, not just in reading, but also as this kind of trusted voice in community, as a place to get information and incredible facts. And oh my goodness, like now in this kind of era of misinformation and disinformation, like our libraries and their role in civic society is more important than ever, to be able to arm kind of consumers and the public with right information from the right sources and kind of know how to critically appraise that information. So yes, libraries are a critical part of all of our communities, especially our community in Flint. I would not be here without my local library as a kid. The favorite thing for my family is going to our public library and the summer reading programs, and the list goes on. So yes, being a doctor in a public hospital or being somebody in a library, that doesn't mean that we're not the only folks allowed to speak up when we see an injustice. No, I think very much implicit in my story and really all these stories is that this is what it means to be part of a society. Like, we've all taken an oath, literally, as as kind of members of a community to kind of raise our hand when we see an injustice, and to take action, and to try to work towards, improving the human condition.
It makes me think about how not every doctor, not every librarian has to, finds a time in their life where they become an activist for their community, and
Yeah.
try to serve their community in these really radical, boundary pushing ways. I'm wondering, do you feel like there was a certain maybe skill that you gained or had that enabled you to become that sort of community serving person? Uh, yeah.
Yeah, I don't, like the book is a memoir. So like I had to ask myself, like, how did I get to do what I'm doing now? Like where did I get these skills? And there's not like one thing like I could point to. Like, I did like leadership and organizing like in high school and college, and I did, research and stuff like that. And those skills all came in handy. I did drama in high school, and that helped with public speaking. So like, there's I'm looking for this quote I have. So it's one of my favorite quotes by by Steve Jobs about like kind of connecting the dots in your past to figure out like where it's going to lead. And he says, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever. So I love that, because like when I look back, like my path had all these disconnected dots. Like, I studied environmental health, and I did political organizing, and I loved literature, and I spent another year in college taking credit writing classes, and like all these things weren't connected. But like now with this like ability to look back, I realized, hey, they were actually all connected. All of these different things enabled me to kind of be who I am, and to be able to have that community voice, and to be that scientist, and to be that advocate. So I love kind of sharing that quote, especially with younger folks who are like trying to figure out like what path I should take. And I, my advice is like, make lots of dots, like go to a random lecture, take a class that may not be in your major, be as well-rounded as possible, read literature, fiction, nonfiction, like go to the library. Like all of these things are dots in your life, and you don't know yet how they're going to connect, but they will.
Mm, Oh, thank you for that. I think throughout this conversation, we've teased out a few of those things that might be necessary for a community to be resilient. And I'm wondering if you think there's any ingredients for a community that we haven't talked about that would make one more resilient.
Uh, um, it's we have a big project in Flint called the Flint Registry. It's this massive kind of surveillance and support project. And when we were building it, we were we do this with our community partners and our parents and our kids, and we asked the community, we asked a group of parents, like, what do you think the logo should be of this registry? What do you think kind of captures the community and the spirit of the community? And a community member suggested the Sankofa bird, which is this mythical African bird that's flying forward and looking back, and it's holding an egg in its mouth. And I love it. And it is the logo of the registry now. It's this beautiful blue bird. But I think it kind of captures everything about community resilience. It is about flying forward. It is about the future and looking ahead. But remember, this bird is looking back. So it's about history, and it's about never forgetting history and never forgetting the injustices that happened and coming to terms with those injustices. And then the bird is holding an egg in its mouth. And that's about kids, right? That's about prioritizing and valuing our kids. And I think those are the critical ingredients to build resilient communities. It's folks who have hope and vision for tomorrow. It's folks who are not blinded by yesterday, and it's folks who prioritize our youngest.
Oh, very inspiring. I think one thing that I'd like to ask you, to sort of, and maybe this is just my impression, but I feel as though when we talked about how Flint was a a leader in the labor movement. It had these leading industries. I feel like now we could consider Flint to be a leading
Yes.
example in community
Yes.
resilience.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. And that has been our intent from the onset,
yeah.
is that we are leading the way in terms of recovery and hope and opportunity and resilience.
Mm.
From the Infrastructure Act to other practices that have become policies, this infant allowance program that hasn't been done anywhere else in the country, we're leading it in Flint, and we're going to share it throughout the country. So Flint continues to lead the way on how best, once again, we build a resilient community.
Mm-hmm. It makes me think too about how librarians, we consider ourselves being a community of practice. We're looking at how other libraries do things to maybe inspire how we do things. Do you see other communities sort of following Flint's lead, or do you look to other communities to sort of inspire you to think
Yeah,
about these new techniques?
absolutely. We are humbly kind of learning from others. We are also very much helping other communities as much as we can who are going through similar kind of experiences. So none of this work happens in isolation. And I try to surround myself with folks that are smarter than me. I always, like, I'll randomly contact somebody in a different city. I'm like, hey, how are you doing this in Cleveland? So like, I think that's really important for all of us to kind of to reach out and ask for help, and to give help.
Hmm. Well, I will say one of my final questions that I was going to ask you is, what are you looking forward to most in your work? I feel like you may have already said it with the RX Kids program.
Yes, it's so exciting. It keeps me up at night. I wake up at like 3 a.m. super excited about it. And
Uh,
we're gonna like embed arts and music in it. It's gonna be this kind of joy. It's gonna be amazing.
and can you tell me again the website that people could go to stay
Yeah.
up to
So
date and also donate?
yeah, so flintrxkids.com. Once again, this is a never been done before citywide, prenatal and infant allowances, recognizing that it is hard to have kids, it is hard to raise a family, and that here we are as society in this very kind of public private partnered way. We're walking alongside you to do this work. So it is we think really kind of changes the narrative on poverty and changes the narrative on how we best, once again, build resilient communities.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mona.
Yeah.
I don't happen to have any other questions, and I wanted to be mindful of your time, but I'm wondering if you had any last final words, though that was also a very excellent way to end the conversation.
I am so excited to be part of this. I'm thrilled. For all those folks out there, thank you for what you do every single day in our communities, making them as resilient as possible.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mona, and I'm
Thank you,
going to end
Sean.
our recording. All right.